All right, I'm back. Now I'm going to talk about the class system. And originally, Karl Marx, who founded conflict theory, he came up with two terms. He talked about as far as the classes go, capitalist and working class. Oh, I swear I have no idea what's wrong with me this morning. Why I cannot quit yawning. I know it's probably really distracting and annoying, but I apologize. But he came up with, two classes, the capitalist and working class. Now, obviously, we know that there are a lot more than just two classes, but back then he came up with those two. The capitalist class, or otherwise known as the bourgeoisie, and that is French. Um, they controlled the means of production, so they had the power. Whatever they wanted to be done, it was done. And he thought in terms of, of economics, so they had control of everything. Whereas the working class or the proletariats, they were basically, subservient to the capitalist class, to the bourgeoisie. Um, they were forced to do the labor and not reap the benefits of it. Marx said eventually the working class would get tired of and overthrow the capitalist class, but we've never had that happen. If you think about power in this country, and wealth, it's something that's still been concentrated in a small percentage of people, at the very top. So um, it's something that I don't really see changing anytime soon. I hope it does one day because the way it's set up is just not fair. It's unfair to so many people, but it'll be hard to see that change. Seeing a total change or a major change anytime soon, but hopefully we can take little steps, step by step, and get it done. I want to mention I'll keep going on with with this class system. Now, Mark said there were two. A lot of times you'll hear a class system of three: upper, middle, and lower class. That's too basic. That's not. That doesn't have enough depth to it. It's not descriptive enough. So, generally speaking, we find we do models. We come up with about six classes. You've got the upper class, or the you got the upper class. You have the upper middle class, the middle class, the working poor, and the underclass. So once again, the upper class, the upper middle class, the middle class, working class, working poor, and underclass. So you've got these different types of classes, and while six might seem like kind of a lot, I could really probably break this down into about 12 to 15 classes. Although I have no interest in doing that because I know you guys don't want to deal with that either. But the upper class, it only is about 1% of the population, but yet it has so much wealth and so much power. You have the upper middle class, which is about 15%. The middle class or the lower middle class is 34% of the population. Working class, 30%. Working poor, 16%, and the underclass about 4 to 5%. So, one thing you might notice is that I listed, middle class and a working class. A lot of times you'll see people combine the two, but that's completely inaccurate because they're nowhere near the same. If somebody's middle class, they don't rely on credit cards a lot to buy necessities. They don't accrue a lot of credit card debt. If they do use their credit cards, they're able to pay them off pretty quickly. Whereas, somebody that's a working class, they continually have a lot of credit card debt. And also, if you're paying on a mortgage, you're also working class. You're not technically truly middle class. If you're truly middle class, you're just not weighed down by debt. Whether it's credit cards or mortgage, student loans, whatever it might be. So, if somebody is really middle class, they're not weighed down by a bunch of debt. So that's really the key difference there between the middle class and the working class. Let's see here. What do we have? All right. Now I want to mention poverty. It's obviously a big issue in this country, big issue worldwide, but it doesn't really get enough attention, as much attention as it should, unfortunately, and not enough has been done about it. A few years ago, our poverty rate was about 15%. I want to say in the last year or two, it was maybe around like 13%. I'll be interested to see how the pandemic affects that, as far as like, when we do research, after it's over, and see how it's affected people, see how many people now are in poverty. But there are ways, the way to determine whether somebody's in poverty is they use what is called a poverty line. And that's what the federal government says is the minimum amount of money for living at a standard level. So basically they say, if you make X amount of money, you're not in poverty. A lot of things wrong with that, because the biggest one is the cost of living. It's not the same everywhere. It's different. Here in the South, it's a lot cheaper, the cost of living, than say like if you were to move to the Northeast into one of the New England states, or if you were to move to the West Coast, into California or to Washington or Oregon. You are going to have a much more expensive cost of living. Like a friend of mine who's from Washington County, originally from Springfield in Washington County, she moved to Seattle, on the outskirts of Seattle, maybe about 5 years ago. I'm really not sure on the timeline, but at her job there, she makes maybe about $60,000 or so. But which I'm like, that's pretty good. But because of the cost of living, if you compare it to living here, she said basically that's like making about $40,000 here, which isn't bad, but it just goes to show you that how much different the cost of living is, how much higher it is in Seattle, on the West Coast in Washington State, than it is here in the South and somewhere like Kentucky. And so I have a very huge problem with the poverty line. Like I said, it's just not accurate. You can't apply it to every single person the same way. It's not right. The official poverty line is, for this year, I think it's $12,760. So basically they say if you make above that or above, you're not in poverty. Really? I can't. Then we also have the poverty rate, which is the amount of people in poverty, which I just mentioned. They measure it as about 13%. And you also have two other terms called relative poverty and absolute poverty. So a lot of times when people think of poverty, they think of it as just people like being really in really bad conditions, being homeless, not having hardly anything, and that's definitely part of it. That's absolute poverty. That's where you can't afford the basic necessities in life, where you just struggle to attain those. But there's also relative poverty, and that's where you can afford the basics, but you don't have enough to meet this basics, what's the word I'm looking for? An average standard of living. With the relative poverty, you can afford those necessities, those basics, but you don't have an average standard of living. So, like, there are a lot of people who, have cars, who have houses or apartments, who, would seem to have everything you would need, but they're still in poverty. So there's, you have to really think about it. And there's actually, of course, there's videos, links on Blackboard for you guys to watch that show you examples of those. Also, with poverty, just a few tidbits. Women are more likely to be in poverty than men. There's a term called the feminization of poverty, which shows women make up an increasing percentage of the poor. Some people refute that and say, "Oh, that's not true." But on average, women make less than men, and a lot of times women, you have a lot of single moms. They're much more likely to be in poverty than a single man would. So, also, when it comes to like age-wise in poverty, the elderly are much less likely to be in poverty than a child. So a child is more likely to be in poverty than somebody than that's elderly, and also non-white people are more likely to be in poverty, have a higher chance, and higher percentage of them are in poverty. Latino and African Americans are much more likely to be in poverty. But those are just a few things I wanted to mention there. That's actually it for this. So I will see you guys later.